Welcome everyone, and I apologize that we had this time shift. I hope people will be able to join us during the presentation or watch this at a later time. So as Thomas said, my name is Catherine. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm also a professional and personal coach. And for the last 20 years have specialized in the field of trauma as well as human trafficking and resilience. During this presentation, I'm going to start the PowerPoint here. Let me see. So during this presentation, we're going to cover a lot of topics. And this is really the idea here is to touch on many different things. And if there's an interest for me to come back and present more thoroughly on one or the other topic, as would be of interest to you. Included in the slides are quotes that were collected when I did some research in Southeast Asia a few years ago. So there's one here. I'm going to keep going. So the way that I got involved in this whole field is actually when I was 3 years old, I heard the story of the little match girl, the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. And it jolted me to the reality of child exploitation. And from then on was always very much alert to those issues in the community around me and within the family. And I started to wonder what happens, how do people heal people who've had these really terrible experiences, how do they heal? And then as I got involved in this whole field of human trafficking, the question rose, is like, okay, well, now I know what it's like to be exposed to personal trauma, but now I'm also exposed to other people's trauma on a daily basis and what it's doing to me and what is out there, how can I help myself and how can we help each other to continue to be able to help people who have been extremely traumatized. So my journey went from these early questions. I became a teacher and I started to notice children coming into my classroom. I had a young boy coming in and his back was covered. His mom had beaten him with a belt. And I decided, all right, I want to work more individually. And I went into the field of psychology. And then from the field of psychology, decided to go into the whole human trafficking and human trafficking, both forced labor and sex trafficking, and look at what's happening out there, and had the opportunity to go in 2002 to Southeast Asia, and I did a independent study in Cambodia, Thailand, the Philippines, India, and Nepal, where I looked at psychosocial recovery programs for survivors, and had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in different shelters. And then I ended up also, I got a doctorate in clinical psychology, and then I did my dissertation looking into how do we train psychosocial counselors to work with survivors of human trafficking. I partnered with a survivor to design some of the skeleton of that information that we developed in a training later on. And then I went and was the lead researcher with ECPAT International. And we did a project that lasted a couple of years, 2015 to 2017, where I met with 67 survivors and 72 service providers in Nepal, Thailand, and the Philippines, also looking at the recovery and reintegration needs of children. We met with some adults as well. And from there, one of the questions I had is, where are the survivors who have acute mental health needs, because their needs are not being met in the shelters that exist, and I'm not seeing them around. And so I started working here. I'm in Northern California, and I work in a psychiatric emergency clinic. We call it a crisis stabilization unit, where I'm seeing on a regular basis human trafficking survivors, both sex trafficking and forced labors, coming through our acute mental health care system. So this is one of the reasons I'm going to be talking about human trafficking from the public health lens, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then looking at the acute mental health care needs of survivors and their psychosocial rehabilitation needs. And then I'll merge and go into how do we take care of ourselves when we do this work. But before I continue, I would like to ask all of you if you could put in the chat where you're signing in from and what your profession is, what population you're working with. Like, I'm curious. It's a small group today. We were supposed to be 60, and it's a small group, so I can engage. We could do a little more conversation here. So please let me know where you're signing in from. It's really nice to meet you, and I'm excited to be presenting here for all of you in Southeast Asia. And as I'm going to present, I will be making a lot of references to information that I'm accessing here in the United States. I'm from Europe. I grew up in France and Belgium, but a lot of my whole professional development was here in the US. And so if there's any resources that you think would be of benefit to the people here and the people who will be watching this video at a later time, please chime in, because I'm sure there are incredible experts out in your area as well. So I'm seeing you're in child protection. Hi there. Hungary is well represented here. All right, while you're typing in your information, I'm going to keep going. So human trafficking in the United States is defined a little bit differently than it is internationally. We don't require necessarily the transportation component. So it could be human trafficking, a parent prostituting, selling their child for sex out of their own apartment would be considered human trafficking. I know in the more the international UN definition, you have to have the component of transportation. The human trafficking is we have this new language since 2000 through something that was called the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And it defined, it gave us a framework, although human trafficking and slavery is nothing new. I have here in the slides, we had slavery back in 4500 before Christ with the Sumerian people, and then the Egyptians and the Greek and the Romans, and and then it continued. A lot of our civilizations are built on the backs of slaves, and I want to acknowledge that. But what these new laws gave us is the capacity to address something that was already existing, but a new framework. And I want to differentiate between trafficking and smuggling, where trafficking, the individual lose complete freedom, and smuggling is that process from going from point one to point two to another point, and then they can move on. There's also kind of a difference working with domestic trafficking as opposed to international trafficking. In the United States, we have a lot of domestic trafficking because of our definition that doesn't require that transportation component that the UN's definition calls for. And then I mentioned also there's different forms of human trafficking. It's important. We've focused a lot on sex trafficking because the word sex has this whole woo component, but we really need to pay attention to labor trafficking. Labor trafficking survivors are often also experiencing sexual violence and exploitation as well. And then there's the whole field also of child abuse materials, which with the whole COVID year has exploded. And you can find more information on Europol sites. There is a great source of information in terms of what's happening in many countries around the world. It's called the Trafficking in Persons Report, the TIP report. And it's a US-based mechanism to look at different countries and see where things are at in terms of addressing prosecution, protection, and prevention. And another really important component to addressing human trafficking is collaboration, partnership. And one of the big pieces, as some of you may know, is that we can't do this alone. So it's very important to create these multidisciplinary teams. And there are now places called family justice centers. I don't know if you have them in your country, but here they're a place where all of the different key stakeholders in helping survivors, whether children or adults, come together and work together. So the person can go to the Family Justice Center and connect with law enforcement. They can connect with the social worker. They can connect with the nurse who's going to do the exams that it may be needed to prove a case. So everyone's together instead of the survivor, whether it's a human trafficking survivor, domestic violence survivor, sexual assault survivor, has only one place to go to. And it's really important to develop these collaborations. As I said, we can't do this work alone. So one of the things that has shifted a lot here in the United States is, and it's still in progress, we have to remember that change can take a long time. We've looked at the human rights, has taken a long time. Women's rights has taken a long time to unfold. Children's rights and the whole field of child abuse and domestic violence, all of these things take time. We make policies and then it takes a while for them to trickle down to the ground to implement them. And until now, we've really looked at human trafficking from the justice lens, where often here in the United States, and let's say women and children who were on the streets being sold were initially looked at as prostitutes and were incarcerated. I worked in a juvenile jail for a while here in California. And I would continually see these young women who were being brought in and charged with loitering for prostitution, when in fact it was human trafficking. But back then, when I was working in that environment, it wasn't recognized as such. And I would continually be told, oh no, these girls, they know what they want. They know what they're getting into. They don't need our help. Let's send them back to their region. And the Human Trafficking Protection Act gave us that framework to say, no, this is human trafficking and we need to intervene. But it was still within the juvenile justice system, or the legal system for adults as well. And the public health framework really brings us to this piece where we need to look at what is upstream. If you're looking at the river of life and the river of human trafficking, instead of just trying to catch people at the other end when it's too late, we need to build bridges so they can go on with their lives without getting caught up in the stream of human trafficking and other human rights abuse and violence. So we need to really look at what are the risk factors as well as the protective factors. This is based on the socio-ecological model, and there was a wonderful presentation done by leaders and founders of an organization I'm a board member of, and I co-chair several committees. It's called Heal Trafficking, and I'll give a little explanation about heal trafficking in a bit. But so they're looking at the factors that are behind the human trafficking. So we're looking at the bigger meta picture of societal risks. There's a need for cheap goods. Our cell phones, there's parts in there that are made by slave labor in certain parts of the country. There's also poverty, lack of resources, racial disparity, discrimination. There's kind of a bigger components that are part of our societies. And then we have the kind of a narrower, our community context. What's going on in our schools, in our workplace, in our environments? Is there a risk of violence? Is there war in our community, fighting, family conflicts, and then the social relationships? That this is the closer circle. So we're kind of going from the societal to the community, to our family, our friends, our colleagues, things that may put somebody at risk. And then there's the individual that has both risk factors and protective factors, whether you have a history of abuse, risky behaviors, if you're an undocumented immigrant. And I'm not sure if this is something that is known in your part of the world, but there was a great study that was done that led to the adverse childhood experiences. And you can go online. I put a link at the end. You'll see there's all these slides with a lot of resources. And you can also do a search online, and you can take this adverse childhood experiences test. And depending on your score, if you have had many of those adverse childhood experiences, this is now shown to place you more at risk for physical health, mental health, and then of course, putting you more at risk for other situations of harm. The other piece about public health framework is really important, the importance of evidence-based research, so that we can develop policies and programs in our communities, in our country, and then internationally. And then the other piece is really being active and working to prevent human trafficking from occurring. So as I mentioned, initially there was only the focus on the criminal justice system, and now we really need to be working together with the public lens approach. So the criminal justice system looking at survivors as victims, the public health looks at it as patients. Criminal justice is really more short-term, justice focus is often more government-based, and then it's focused on prosecution, which we know in the field of human trafficking has been very difficult. And then in the public health approach, we're really looking at the long term, we're looking at the individual, we're looking at how the individual is doing within the community. And there's three different mechanisms in the prevention. There's primary, we need, what we need to do before it starts, like I was talking before, creating those bridges at the top of the river so the person doesn't fall down and then we have to pick them up wounded. The secondary prevention is identifying survivors right at the beginning as they are being trafficked before true, real, extensive harm happens. And then the next part is tertiary, is when we know that someone is being trafficked, how do we stop them from being re-trafficked, and how do we mitigate and do harm reduction while we're trying to help them get out of these situations. So a big piece that's happened here in the United States is that we then have started to work with healthcare facilities and healthcare professionals to be able to identify human trafficking survivors in different areas, whether it's independent professionals, medical, dental, mental health professionals, whether it's at emergency rooms, whether it is at Planned Parenthood, which is a place where women go for gynecological health care, whether it's hospitals. And we've started to train people all the way from security guards in the parking lot to the intake clerical staff, to the janitors, to everyone, in order to identify human trafficking within these healthcare settings. Because we know, and there's been several studies, but this one in 2014, we know that there's more than 87% people who are being trafficked who will come in contact with a healthcare provider during their trafficking experience. So it's very important that we really open up this whole perspective of human trafficking as a public health issue. There are a variety of experiences, and I'm not going to go during this presentation on all of the impacts of being human trafficked in terms of the impact on mental health, the impact on physical health, but I'm just going to have outlined here some of the different components, potential experiences that an individual may have while they're being trafficked. And some of them, like cult-like indoctrination, I had looked at that when I wrote my dissertation, because one of the things that happened was this brainwashing that some of the traffickers do. And how do we help a survivor who has been indoctrinated? And I think that there's a lot of information that's available within those separate fields that we can really pull together to help human trafficking survivors heal. I'm also adding in there COVID-19, because things have changed a lot this last year with people not being able to be out in the community. So things happening more and even more hidden in plain sight. And because of social workers and outreach workers not being able to go out on the streets and actually meet face to face with some of the street children or the homeless folks. And then also what I've seen at my work is a lot of the homeless population, and including human trafficking survivors who are out there on the streets, not being able to access their social workers, not being able to be able to meet with them and get, whether if they needed a phone, whether they needed to obtain their medications. So it's really, that's a whole other level of experience. And then the other piece that is also very salient and challenging for human trafficking survivors who have been exploited through sexual abuse images is to know that these images are out there forever, and it's very difficult for them to be removed. So that's another component to their healing journey. So when I did this research in Southeast Asia with ECPAT International, we looked at all these different areas that were felt were important in the psychosocial rehabilitation. And one of the big pieces, who the frontline staff is, who's working with the survivors, and I'll get into that a little bit later, is the prevention piece. And I'm putting the prevention piece because there's, it's not just preventing people who are not so far yet trafficked. However, when we're doing prevention trainings, there may be survivors who are out there who are currently being exploited, who are hearing and listening to this information, and they're finding out, oh, this is what I'm experiencing is actually human trafficking. So prevention also helps individuals who are currently trafficked with new information. The importance of hotlines, the importance of outreach, the importance of having drop-in centers where individuals can go get food, can connect to resources, can shower, can meet with other peers. It's also really important how raids and rescue, the rescue is kind of a controversial term here in the States among survivors, but this is how do we collaborate so that law enforcement doesn't just go in there and it can be really traumatizing. We need to have healthcare providers or social workers, a team of individuals that accompany law enforcement to make this as trauma-informed and victim-centered as possible. And then there's all these different areas. I'm going to focus more on the mental health component. But as you see, it's important to have life skills, to have opportunities to learn to play again and recreate, peer-to-peer support and leadership. And then how do we do repatriation, and then the whole reintegration component? Can the person go back where they came from, or how do we help them integrate in a whole new community? And what kind of services do we have for them in terms of long-term care? So as I mentioned earlier, when I've traveled in these different countries and I've looked at human trafficking, in Southeast Asia, in the United States, and in Western Europe, one of the things that has really struck me is that we're not meeting the needs of survivors who are having acute mental health care needs. These are people who are severely depressed, where the light in their eyes is gone and they're just letting themselves die, of individuals who are highly addicted to substances. Here in the US, we have a big problem with methamphetamine as well as fentanyl. We have a lot of overdosing that's happening. And then there's also, sorry, go back to the depression, is suicide. There's a very high rate of suicide amongst human trafficking survivors. There's an organization called Global Health Promises, and the resource information is in the slides, which I'll make available to you if you're interested. So what's really important, so then we have also psychosis, dissociation. And so at my work right now, I work at the Sonoma County Behavioral Health Crisis Stabilization Unit, and we see people, we have a little clinic, and we see people there who are acutely mentally ill. And what I've seen is that, so, we'll have a 19-year-old female, I'm just gonna use the story, whether it's a female, it's a male, transgender, it's anyone on the spectrum, gender spectrum, come in and we assess them. They're way too acute in their presentation. They're either violent, they're either completely shut down, they're thinking, they're high on drugs, or they're dissociated. And we try to stabilize them and find them a psychiatric hospital. And you see here, there's the loop that I created. So we see them there, we find them a psychiatric hospital, they get stabilized at the psychiatric hospital, they go back in the community for a while, they can manage their symptoms, and then they get acute again because they don't have access to their medication, or they are just too disorganized to be able to get onto a regimen of medication. They're maybe not receiving therapy, and then they're back in our emergency room again. And another thing that's happening is that shelters, whether it's shelters for a larger group of people, whether it's a homelessness shelter or a shelter for domestic violence survivors that includes human trafficking survivors, or whether it's a program that is specific to human trafficking survivors, the staff is not usually skilled and trained to be able to manage and work with these acute mental illness presentation. So this organization that I mentioned earlier, Heal Trafficking, we've started a group, a project to see about addressing these gaps within the cycle of acute mental health care needs. And we've seen that there's a need in terms of advocacy. We need to do case consultation and support so that we build the capacity of existing programs to help survivors with acute mental health care needs. We need to educate and train the whole psychiatric system, because we've been focusing with the public health stream, public health lens in the more medical perspective care for survivors. But we also need to do the same thing with psychiatric care. And this is very often when I contact psychiatric hospitals, they don't have anything planned, so that by the time that person is stabilized, they should be able to receive information, resources, and being told, okay, if you wish, this is the program that's available. We can help you with your drug addiction. We can help you get out of the situation of human trafficking. And then same thing in the community, wherever someone is accessing some kind of mental health support. It's important for psychologists, therapists, social workers who are providing mental health care to be educated on human trafficking and the unique needs and the unique impacts and needs of that population. And then, of course, we need to do more research in this field of acute mental health care needs for human trafficking survivors. So when I did this study with ECPAT International, what the children told me, the child survivors, what they needed for healing was love, kindness, nurture, trust, and understanding. And these things would seem obvious, but this is not necessarily what I saw in some of the programs and shelters because of a lot of the burnout that I would see among staff. So what would happen is I would see, and I saw that too, and I did the research in 2002 in Southeast Asia, 5 countries back then. Staff is re-traumatizing the people that they're trying to help. So it's really important that we start focusing on ourselves and how we are with the people that we're engaging with and trying to support. The survivors said they want respect, dignity, and a sense of belonging. They want us to be committed. They want us to be friendly. They want to be informed each step of the way. They want things to be transparent. They also need structure, a rhythm to their day, to their activities, and that stability. The other piece is really important is that we engage, that we not just call ourselves the experts. The true experts are the survivors themselves. And so really engaging, we're doing this together. We all have this expertise, and how do we better our psychosocial rehabilitation programs? It's also very important to be trauma informed. I've seen that too many times, conflict happening in places where healing had an opportunity, because the caregiver, the therapist, the director of a program wasn't really sensitive to what trauma is like and how trauma affects individuals, and how a simple shift in how we hold ourselves, how we speak, our tone, our gestures can really impact the response, the experience of that a survivor has during that exchange. I often, when I speak with trauma survivors, we often talk about, so we're a victim. So there's that concept, the legal concept of a victim, to me is that this is still happening. You're still happening. You're still caught in the abuse, the violence, the trafficking, and you're also a survivor because you're alive. But as a survivor, then I say, okay, now you're a survivor. You're out of that experience of trafficking, but your response to all these traumatic events is still controlling you. So as a survivor, there's a healing journey for you to move through that, so you can start not being controlled by the emotional dysregulation and the somatic experiences, the bodily sensations, the medical consequences, all of that impact, and you can start to thrive. So be more free of all the impact that the trauma has had. And then you can move to this place of champion. And we see so many examples, and this is really what helps me pull through year after year of working with severe trauma content, is to know that we are incredibly resilient, and with the right kind of support, we, survivors can become survivor leaders. And we have the example around the world of amazing organizations. I put a few here on the slide that are survivor founded and survivor led, and this is happening all over the world. So there's a lot of writing in the next few slides. I'm not going to get into the details of that. You can take your time. You can revisit the slides at another time. But what really stood out when I met with all of these 72 service providers was, and the children who spoke with me and said, this is what we need, is really to go into this work of helping individuals who've experienced some of the worst horrific experiences that our mind can't even conceive of. And I don't even want to call forth, because some of the things I've heard are really terrifying. And again, it's like, my gosh, I'm amazed that people can really survive this. So it's we need to have skills, and training is very important to, as I said, trauma informed, human trafficking informed, and also that we're taught by survivor leaders as well on how to engage, what are the words that are appropriate or not appropriate, what works, what doesn't work, that we are committed. Survivors really have, a lot of them have attachment issues, so this is a little tricky, and we need to earn their trust and therefore be committed to this work. And then also the capacity to work as a team. I mentioned earlier the importance that we can't do this alone. We need to be part of a multidisciplinary team, multi-agencies, because there's so many different components, as you saw earlier on the slide with all the different parts, whether it was education, medical health, mental health. It's also really important that we learn how to take care of ourselves then, because we're confronted to a lot of very difficult information. And if we can't compartmentalize it, have a place for it, then we're going to be affected deeply. It's impossible not to be affected doing work like this, that there's no way out. We are human beings, we have a heart, but there's ways to protect ourselves and to nurture our resilience so that we can continue doing this work without engendering more trauma or hurting people inadvertently. Some of the things that we need to pay attention to is our safety. That's always a first. And then the traumatic countertransference. What is this material? What is the stories that we're hearing? What is that generating in us? And how do we keep ourselves mindful of that and not project it out, transfer it out onto the person we're working with. There's also our the traumatic stress, so that when we are out there on the streets, where we're out there in a shelter, where we're out there, when I was conducting research and actually seeing children being sold on the streets of Pattaya in Thailand, that is traumatizing. So we also have to manage our own trauma when we're doing this work. And then there's also the secondary traumatic stress, which is when we hear the stories of the individuals that we're working with, it has an impact on us. It's like people who were watching the planes flying into the Twin Towers in New York, or watching images of war. We get traumatized. And so this is called secondary traumatic stress, and it's really important to monitor that. Vicarious trauma is kind of similar, has a little deeper wound in us, where we're really internalizing those other experiences, these traumatic experiences, and then the stress that comes from being exposed to all of this really difficult content leads to us being compassion fatigued, which means that we just don't have the energy anymore to, like, I can't hear another story, or I need a break. I'm just fatigued. I can't just be there and give anymore. So it's very important that we can all reach this point. And then also empathic failure, it's the same thing. I cannot sit and be present with someone who is crying or who is remembering these horrific experiences. These are all things that we are at risk of experiencing doing this work. And moral injury, that's a big one. because we are working in systems that are not ideal in the most part. And I'll speak for a lot of the places I've seen and the places I've worked at, where like right now, we're trying to help individuals who have acute mental health care needs. And I'm sending them to a psychiatric hospital, they get stabilized, they feel better, and they're brought right back to the streets with no follow-up services and right back into the human trafficking piece. And that creates an injury in ourselves. So how do we address that is really important. And then you've got the extreme of the burnout. And I know in Europe, it's a big buzzword. And in Europe, in some countries, there's a lot of support that's available. People are put on burnout leave. And I wish we had that in the United States, but we don't. But the burnout is really difficult. Once you're burnt out, you can't get out of bed, you have no more interest in life, you have, it's a kind of this depression, but it also has this physical component of just no energy. And it can take a long time to recover from burnout. So we really, the self-care, I call it, it's our ethical responsibility. Just like when you get on an airplane, you have to, you're taught like put your mask on in case the oxygen doesn't work, and you have to put the mask on before you can put it on the person or the child next to you. So we have to take care of ourselves first. Some of the things that some of the staff, the direct service providers talked about that was helpful in their work environment is included here. It's a slide from the actual report. So there's simple things, and I'm wondering here at this point, and I have just a few more things I want to say. What is it that you have found in your work environment that has been helpful in order to take care of yourself and your staff, your team in your work environment? What are some things that are in place? And you could put that in the chat box. So some of the things here, just taking more breaks, going outside, taking a breath, encouraging to take time off, doing staff activities, retreats. Is there something in your work environment that you think is really helpful to you? All right, I will, you feel free to type that in when you feel like taking a sick leave if things are really tough. Yes, absolutely. What's tricky often for us professionals is to actually let go and actually take care of ourselves. We're so good at being there for others, and it's very important that we shift this piece to taking care of ourselves. Go to nature, hiking. Yep, that's my thing too. So as I mentioned earlier, we're extremely resilient, and it's important to hold on to that. One of the things that keeps me really strong, as I mentioned earlier, is to see the resilience of people who have been through way more horrific things than I have been through, and how they're able to move forward. So it's really important that we hold that piece for them when they're not, and that when they're not connected to their wholeness, to their resourcefulness, to their creativity, but that we hold the hope for them and say, you don't have to feel this way the rest of your life. There is hope. There is a way for you to heal. We also need to accept and be humble that we will be affected by this, and it's okay. We just need to do whatever we can to mitigate the longer term and the more severe impact, like I talked about in the earlier slide, the risks for compassion fatigue and moral injury, empathic failure, and burnout. A big piece is being kind with ourselves, and there's a whole field of self-compassion, which is really nurturing. How do we nurture ourselves? How do we be kind to ourselves the way we are kind with other people? And that we know that there's a whole post-traumatic growth journey possible. Something that is really important, and there's a lot more research coming out, is the importance of experiencing awe, being amazed. When you're standing under the sky, looking at all the stars and planets out there, it's amazing, it's wonderful. And that has a lot of positive impact in our body and how we experience the world. Same thing with gratitude, shifting our mindset, because we're wired to focus on the negative for survival. And it's an effort, it's a practice to focus. Okay, let's say, every day I'm going to think of what I'm grateful for. I'm grateful right now for Child Hub, for this opportunity to speak to all of you and to have, I'm hoping for a little more conversation. And please follow up with me if you have any questions. I'll give you my contact information at the end. But this is I'm really grateful for this experience. I'm grateful for a beautiful day. What is it that we can focus on that we're grateful for? Can make, kind of nurtures our resilience. Being in nature, as somebody mentioned, the art, dancing, singing. For some people, self-care is also social activism. There's a need for that. So, all this energy, this frustration, oh my goodness, that's how I felt at my work. I'm seeing all these human trafficking survivors coming through our psychiatric emergency room, and then they go back on the street and be exploited again. So we started this project with Heal Trafficking. And then there's this, being present, doing mindfulness exercises, being grounded, being in your body, open to your senses, slowing things down in our life, and then stopping things if really needed. So I put here different exercises. I'm looking at the time here. We have just a few more minutes. I'll touch on the breathing exercise, because we know now from research from Dr. Porges, I don't know if you're familiar with the polyvagal theory, but we have a mechanism, the sympathetic system, the parasympathetic system, so as much as we have our system in our body to react and deal with stress, we also have a mechanism to calm ourselves down. And one of them is in the exhale, and having a longer exhale. So when a good exercise is to breathe in slowly and deeply, counting to 4, and then holding our breath for 2 seconds to the count of 2, and then to exhale slowly to the count of 6. I'm going to invite you right now to do that. So we're going to breathe in to the count of 4, holding our breath to the count of 2, and then exhaling slowly to the count of 6. Feeling all the air coming out of our tummy. So being in touch with our body, we're often a lot here and our emotions are very involved. We're really coming into your body. Self-compassion gestures. I see some of you are on the video. What are some self-compassion gestures that you can think of? So one of them is you can put your hand on your heart, being kind with yourself. Some people will say you can hug yourself. Just a simple touch to self has an incredible impact on our whole physiology and our mental health. There's a great researcher, Kristen Neff, the resources in the slides as well, who's specialized on self-compassion. I invite you to read some of her work, and she has videos too that you can listen to. The main question is what is most healthy for me in this moment? Always remembering that. All right, I'm gonna open up for questions. If you have any questions, and we're a small group that you're welcome to unmute if that's possible. Thomas, is that possible for them to unmute? As I mentioned, I covered a lot of ground.
It is. No, everybody can take
if there's
the
an
chance.
interest, then come. What?
No, everybody have the chance to unmute herself
Yeah,
or
please.
himself, so
Please feel
free
free.
to
I
ask
would
a
love to
question.
hear any questions. I said this has been a lot of information. I can come back and we can kind of expand on one or the other topic at a later time. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions, you want to share your experience. Nobody wanting to join in? What's happening in your, is anyone here working with human trafficking survivors, whether it's child sexual exploitation or other forms of child exploitation? No. All right, if you can at any time, you could put the questions in the chat. You can also contact me or contact Thomas, and we can follow up if you want some answers or curious about something. So I'll just go through, if you have any questions, jump in at any moment, all right? I'm gonna go through quickly the slides that I prepared just as resources for you. Yes.
Catherine, we received the first
Yes.
question. It
Oh,
is
great.
that, do you think it's damaging for the media and films and books to romanticize the Stockholm Syndrome?
Well, I think that whenever we romanticize something, we take it out of its reality. And I think that that's the media. The media has definitely is very skillful in transforming information, and I think in ways that may not be as helpful. So um, I'm wondering what others here in the group may think as well. But yeah, I think whenever we romanticize anything, it's risky. Is that something that, do you have an example of that you want to, who is it that, Rika, do you want to speak up, or is there something specific that you've experienced?
Maybe just that I'm not sure if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So I'm still really young, I'm only 20, but the first like meeting, or like the first time I heard about like human trafficking and sex trafficking was related to like a story, like a novel or something. And then when I researched it, I realized how like damaging it really is. And I think like in my generation, a lot of like teenage girls like idolize like Stockholm syndrome and stuff like this. And I'm not sure how to like talk about that in a healthier way, like how it's not romantic for you to fall in love with someone who abuses you, and this context of like romantic movies and stuff.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a difference between novels and movies, you know, and then the media, journalism. I think to me, journalism really ought to stay more on the truth of things. Novel movies have more leeway. We do have, you know, freedom of expression, but to me, it goes back to the human morality, to human responsibility of what it is that we're conveying, and how what we're conveying shapes minds and shapes cultures. So that's a whole, you know, debate of, do we, you know, do we transform reality, such as, you know, the traumatic bond between a survivor victim and their perpetrator? Is that a freedom of speech and creation topic, or, you know, do we have this responsibility of what it is that we're conveying here, and which ends up in this case minimizing the severity of this dynamic, which keeps people really caught up in that and having a hard time getting out of their trafficking situation. Here, you know, that we talk about the different types of traffickers. One of them that has a really powerful hold is the one that's going to pretend that to be your lover, pretend that you know, they want you to fall in love with them. It's the most addictive. You know, there's this idea that, oh, you know, the trafficker is going to give them drugs, but drugs cost them. Having you fall in love with them is not going to cost you anything. So they're masterful in playing this kind of the lover person, and then you're caught in that, and it's hard to get out because there's an attachment. And often human trafficking survivors will have had poor attachment, and here's this person who's initially being super nice to them, or in the case of Stockholm syndrome, is very threatening, but you know that if you're trying to be nice to them, then, you know, you have a better chance to survive. When we look at the traumatic responses, we look at fight, flight, freeze, but we also have feign, or some people call it fawn, which is this part where we're trying to please the person, to try to appease them so that the consequences may be less for us or for the survivor. So does that
Thank you. That
help?
was really interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you for your question. That's a good one. I hadn't thought about that. I really am curious where you're at and what's, what questions you may have. Please jump in. All right, I'm gonna go through the slides, and if other questions come up, please, yeah, we can answer a couple more questions. So I've prepared these resources. One of the things that's really, I mentioned earlier, is survivor leadership. We have so much to learn from survivors. And so I put here Survivors Alliance, and they have a World Congress. If you know of any survivors who may be interested, it's an online conference and it's free. The link is there. We also have the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. We also have in the US the National Survivors Network. There's another conference there. I put at the bottom the ECPAT International. This is the report from the study that I did. Also, I talked very early in the presentation about adverse childhood experiences. Here's a website. You can find more information. There's many other websites, but these are some of the things that if you've experienced any 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or more of these things, you're at higher risk for physical and emotional mental health issues, and higher risk also for being trafficked. Heal Trafficking is the organizations that I mentioned I'm a board member of, and that really brought the whole field of human trafficking into the public health lens. And they have, we have wonderful items here. You can go to the website, and we have a protocol toolkit that can be used in schools or hospitals, medical or psychiatric hospitals, to help develop a protocol within your facility of how do you identify a person, how do you engage, and then what do you do when you know that somebody is a trafficking survivor. There's also developed these core competencies. Sorry, French is my first language, and sometimes when I say English words, it just stumbles. So these core competencies that you can base trainings on, looking at what things are really important to include in trainings. And then assessment tools also. How do you assess for human trafficking? So you can go to these websites. Thomas, is it possible for me to send like a PDF version of the PowerPoint and send that to everybody? Okay.
Of course,
I'll
thank you
send
very
that
much
to
for
you.
that.
Here's also the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Program. They have a SOARS website, and you can get a lot of training there. If you want to learn more about human trafficking, about trauma-informed care, human trafficking and mental health, how to work in school-based, specific for schools, there's information. They also have a wonderful survivor leadership academy for survivors to become leaders. So that's and that's really we really encourage for organizations to grow, to include survivors, because so often what survivors will say is like, okay, we'll be at a panel discussion, and there's on one side everyone that's called expert, and then there's the person called survivor, and the survivor is like, well, wait a minute, I'm the expert too. Why am I always looked at as survivor? Why am I not looked at that I also have a degree as a nurse, or I have a degree as a teacher? Not just being labeled only a survivor. There's also another assessment tool that the West Coast Children's Clinic here in California developed to identify commercial sexual exploitation of children. So you can have a look at that and see if you can adapt it to your area. The TIP report I mentioned early on. I also mentioned that with COVID-19, there's been a lot more child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse material done. You can look at the studies that Europol's done. And anyway, so I'm just gonna go through, and then I wrote down all these people to me have been really helpful in enhancing my work with survivors and in helping myself continue to do this work. So have a look at these different people and their approaches if you don't already know them. I would love to know if there are big names in Southeast Europe. Who are the people that you turn to for trauma information? Oh, there you go, Kristen Neff. Yeah. Oh, I just love her work. Yeah. And then one more, just different approaches. So, you know, I talked earlier about public health lens and the importance of evidence-based information, but I want to say that there's a lot of good things yet that we don't necessarily have had the funding to do research on, but we see that are really promising practices. Some here have done, have had a lot of research. We know they're evidence-based, but there's other things that are promising, and we know how good it feels to us, for some of us, to go out in nature. So we know that there's really good to be done with ecotherapy. There's incredible work that's being done with horses, healing through relationship with horses, equine therapy. We know music helps us, dancing helps us. But again, you need to have a lot of money to do research, to measure these things. And it's hard when you do research. You have to have, you know, kind of the same thing over and over again to be able to measure it properly. And some of these are difficult to measure. TRE, tension and trauma releasing exercise, is something that I'm certified to teach. Is really powerful. We are. Oh, I'm seeing that we're running out of time here, so I'll wrap it up. But we have a natural mechanism to shake stress off, and there's these simple exercises that you can learn, and you can do that on your own. Just shaking this stress off. You'll sleep better, you'll eat better, you'll digest better, your anxiety levels will drop off. People are using it even with people like multiple sclerosis. There's incredible research being done. It's being used in the military. So check that out if you're not familiar with TRE. All right, I'm gonna wrap things up here. I could talk for a long time. So thank you everyone for joining me here, and Thomas, for this opportunity to present. You can reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. You can send me a message and I'll be happy to email you back. If you have any questions in the next, this evening, tomorrow, please reach out. And thank you to everyone for the work that you are doing in making this world a better place and supporting people in their healing journeys. So thank you.